Hello and welcome to another actionable video from the Grow Big initiative. Today we're talking to Dan Brewer from Digital River about all things cross-border e-commerce expansion and the merchant of record model. What I love about talking to Dan is he comes from a financial perspective. With 11 years at Digital River, 6 years in corporate finance, he really understands the implications your decisions can make on your financial structure as you expand internationally. So, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you for having me, Josh.
We have one question to start off to give us context as to where you're calling in from. What is a hobby farm?
So a hobby farm is, I like to think of it as people who like the idea of farming, but don't necessarily want to make that commitment. My wife and I live in the Colorado area, and we've got a small hobby farm with chickens and ducks. And we actually picked up a couple of pigs in the last year. And it's our little getaway at home. And we love to be outdoors and enjoy our animals.
Thank you for sharing. That's one of the things I like about the global e-commerce space is people come from all walks of life and they're doing all sorts of different things, especially now in the digital world. Obviously, also your wife also has an e-commerce business. Is it angry tags, mad tags, bad tags?
Yeah, you got it there at the end. My wife has a e-commerce business called Bad Tags. And Bad Tags is basically funny or cheeky pet tags. And she sells them to pet owners all over the world.
Great, and she's got the in-house consultation on payments and merchant of record.
She's getting some special in-house consulting, no question.
Okay, so for all those bad tags and above kind of merchants on there online, we're going to dive in right now. We've got a slide up, and I'm just going to let you run down because you've got a lot of great insights, and you've already laid it out into our cool slide decks, and then I probably will jump in and out as needed.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. So I'm going to talk about how merchants can build and optimize a cross-border strategy so that you can expand your business internationally. And I'm going to go through 3 sections in this presentation. First, I'm going to talk about why cross-border matters, why it needs to be a part of your strategy if you're a merchant that participates in the e-commerce space. Second, I'm going to talk about the challenges that are associated once you do decide to expand your business globally. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about what you need to be successful. And I'll give you 3 keys that I think all merchants need to think about. So before we jump in, let me step back a little bit and just hit on the point that retail e-commerce in general is so critical to merchants today. It's absolutely exploding. This is the only channel inside of your business where it's effectively growing everywhere in basically every market in the world. And if you look at the last 10 years, this channel is now 5 times bigger than it was. And there's really no other part of your business that you can say the same about. Now, diving a little bit deeper, why is cross-border relevant? Why does it matter so much? I've already hit on the point that global e-commerce in general is growing at an enormous rate. It's now about 20% of all retail, and last year it grew 14%. So it's likely to be your fastest growing channel. It's also an enormous TAM. There's now 4 billion internet users, and about half of those are proven digital buyers. So the TAM, the ability to get at these folks is increasing every year. Most importantly, I think this is really the data point that hits on why it's so critical you have a cross-border strategy. 57% of those digital buyers have now purchased something from a foreign merchant. So you have almost 2/3 of people who are willing to make a purchase from somebody outside of the market they normally purchase in. And I think that's really the metric that tells you this is a critical part of your strategy going forward. And so with all that in mind, I think you have to recognize that this is an area where there's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be winners who make the investment to participate in this segment, and there's going to be losers who delay making the investment and just fall further behind in one of the fastest growing spaces in e-commerce. Now, I also want to make the point that cross-border is a part of a broader strategy. I talk to a lot of people who think of cross-border as the end-all be-all, and you should really think of cross-border as the foundation for a much bigger global e-commerce strategy. Cross-border is going to tell you a lot about your business and where your opportunities lie. It's going to tell you the markets that you can be successful with, and it's going to tell you the markets that are growing the fastest. So this is going to give you a roadmap of sorts for where you should focus your energy in the future. And I frequently see merchants make two steps in the future after they've launched a cross-border store themselves. The first is expanding into international marketplaces. That's another form of digital commerce that allows you to go deeper in some of these international markets. And the latter is actually setting up regional e-commerce operations where you may move inventory in country closer to your customers so that you can sell more and deliver a better customer experience. And as you go through that journey, you need to understand that the investment and the level of complexity is only going to increase. So it's critical that you use your cross-border foundation to really tell you where to go. Now, let's dive into the challenges that are associated with global expansion. I like to use the iceberg analogy because I think it really articulates the point well. We tend to think about the things that you can see, the customer experience elements, and those are incredibly important. And we'll talk about why they're a critical part of expanding your business globally. But it's actually the things you can't see that I think cause the greatest challenge for merchants. It's everything that's beneath the surface, to use the iceberg analogy. It's things like localization and being able to execute language translations and have multi-currency pricing. It's compliance requirements. In particular, compliance requirements in markets that you're not accustomed to doing business in. It's payments and tax, which we take for granted in a way because we have those capabilities in our domestic market, but we don't really understand how they change when we expand into international markets. And of course, it's logistics, just getting your product from point A to point B in a seamless customer experience. There's all kinds of issues and challenges that merchants are going to run into just to deliver the goods that they've already sold. And so what are the main pain points? I've just given you a lot to think about and a lot of scary things that are out there, but what are the ones that merchants struggle with the most? From my perspective, tax, payments, and logistics are the areas that you really have to think through and have a strategy for, because there's all kinds of landmines your business is going to run into. Now, let's take a bit of a closer look at each of those. And I'll start with tax. I think tax is an area that has become increasingly complicated in recent years. I would argue this is the greatest barrier to entry for most merchants. And there's really three industry trends that have played out and continue to play out that I think merchants need to be aware of. First, you have a number of countries who have established tax rules that are based around low value thresholds. So basically what's happening is merchants are becoming subject to VAT and GST rules when they sell low value goods cross-border into these markets. This has been adopted by the UK, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, Norway. So there's a growing list of countries who have established these rules, now forcing merchants to recognize that they have tax nexus and they'll have to deal with tax compliance in these markets. Second, there's been a real change in buyer expectations when it comes to cross-border shipments. There's now an expectation that the shopper can prepay tax and duty. And that's made it much more complicated for merchants because now they have to think about presenting the appropriate import taxes and duties to the customer real time when they're checking out, as opposed to the customer paying a bill later when their products are delivered. And so that's a capability merchants now have to be competitive. And last, for merchants who sell digital services, either as their main product or as an additional way of monetizing their customers, this is a really interesting area because the borders have been all but erased in the digital services economy. And there's now 60 plus countries who require that foreign sellers of digital services follow their VAT and GST rules. And that's created an enormous challenge for merchants to register, to deal with tax processes, and to pay all these different jurisdictions. And so these trends in the tax industry have a lot of consequences. They've created compliance risks. Customers have bad experiences if these aren't done well. And I think ultimately they've limited the ability for merchants to expand their business globally. Let's now dive into payments a little bit, because payments is another area where industry trends are driving a lot of the complexity. When you think about retail channels offline, it's common for us to think about customers paying with credit cards and debit cards. But when you think about retail commerce online, it's not always the predominant way of making payments, and especially in international markets. Payment methods vary significantly, and we tend to think about what's relevant in our own domestic market. For instance, outside of the US, you have a much greater adoption in wallets, in banking-based payment methods. These are basically viewed as more secure, more trustworthy methods of making payment. And so customers expect that you have those available when they want to purchase. You also have a huge change in how customers use payment methods between devices. Traditionally, e-commerce was happening in a browser-based laptop or computer setting, but in the last 5 to 10 years, it's aggressively transitioned to mobile. And on mobile, customers want a very fast checkout experience, which means that they want to tap into wallets and express checkout methods, because those are much more trustworthy and speedy. And so you really have to think about challenges not only on the front end, presenting the appropriate methods of payments, but also a lot of challenges on the back end for the CFO and his or her organization, because now you have all these different sources of payment that you have to reconcile and be able to collect on. And finally, none of this matters if you don't have a logistics solution that allows you to get your products to your customers in a cost-effective way. And there's really two types of challenges that merchants are going to bump into in the logistics space. You have the operational challenges. So things like understanding country restrictions, dealing with product labeling requirements and product classifications, and of course, export and import documentation so that your product actually makes it across the border successfully. You also have checkout considerations. You need to be able to present your shopper with shipping quotes that are reasonable and take into account first mile and last mile shipments. And of course, you have to be able to determine the appropriate duties and taxes so that the customer can prepay those when they make their purchase. And then on the back end, you have to be able to reconcile with what your carrier is billing you for all these different fees. And so logistics, of course, is table stakes for anybody who wants to expand their business globally, but comes with its own set of complexities.
So that was like the bum me out section of the presentation. It's like, this is all the challenges. So talk to us. How are we going to solve this problem?
You bet. So it's a huge problem for merchants to solve. So there's really 3 areas that you should focus your attention. First and foremost, you have to create a customer experience that's localized, an experience that your customers will enjoy and that they expect to have. And that starts with customers having the ability to navigate your store and shop in the appropriate country, which means you need a multi-locale setup. Then as customers are going through product discovery, you need the right language represented throughout your store and pricing in the appropriate currency, the currency that they're ultimately going to make payment in. And once you get to the checkout, they need to have a buying experience that's consistent with the shopping experience that they had, which means presenting the appropriate payment methods and giving them the ability to pay the right taxes and duties for the country they are buying from. Fulfillment operations. My advice is make sure you choose a logistics partner that can help you not only today, but also with where your business is going to go. Your today need is going to be cross-border shipments. But as your business grows internationally, and as you reach certain milestones in different countries, it's likely that you'll expand to having regional e-commerce operations, which means you'll need a logistics partner who has the ability to support in-country shipments as well. Second, make sure you choose a logistics partner who has experience with product classifications and can help you navigate the complexity. There's an enormous amount of detail in the harmonized code system, and country-specific tariff codes are going to be critical for you to be able to present the right duties and ultimately not lose money on allowing your customers to pay for them in advance. And then finally, make sure your partner has the ability to ship DDP. DDP means duties delivered paid, and DDP is really the method of shipment that customers now expect so that they can pay for everything up front and not get a second bill once their product is delivered. And finally, checkout and back office. I would encourage you to really think about a merchant of record solution to help you simplify all of this. If you're not familiar with merchant of record solutions, you get both the capabilities you need, things like payments, fraud, tax, compliance, all the capabilities we've talked about today, but you also get a passport of sorts for your business because merchant of record solutions handle all of the merchant responsibilities behind the scenes so that you don't have to make investments in your back office and you don't have to take on additional risk that you weren't expecting to take on when you make the decision to expand globally. And lastly, a bit of a bonus tip here. Think about your payment strategy as being a well-rounded strategy. It is not a single-threaded strategy. The worst thing that could happen is you execute international expansion, and at the end, your conversion rates and your acceptance rates are not what you expect. And I see this happen to a lot of merchants. You really need to consider the ability to use local card acquiring so that your authorization rates are where they need to be. The ability to route to different processors so that if one is down, your business is still up. And of course, the ability to, in a configurable way, show the right payment options, including things like buy now, pay later, which are now a critical part of any retail e-commerce strategy. And so all these considerations are sometimes overlooked when you go down this path, but make sure they're a well thought out part of your strategy so that down the road, your performance is what you would expect.
So happens that Digital River has this solution. Of course, that's why we want Digital River and Dan to come on the call, because I think it's important for people to understand a little bit more about Digital River, but also around the merchant of record model. They're not all created equal. And I got my fancy nifty globe that shows up in a lot of my videos. But let's talk about using our model here. The merchant of record model, essentially, right? You're selling from, let's say, this part of the globe, and you're selling here, but you've got a US, let's say, bank account. And I apologize, this thing moves all on its own. But let's imagine it's not moving. From one side, local bank. You got the other side, local bank in the consumer country. Your local bank, as the merchant, communicates and sells a product to the consumer. The consumer then has their local bank communicating against their consumer bank. and that those banks then have to communicate directly cross border, and there's a lot of breakdown in communication that results in inaccurate decline rates. Could you talk a little further around that?
You got it. Yeah, you did very well there. This is oftentimes not well understood by merchants, but there's a very important part about payments that you need to consider when you're transacting internationally. This concept of local card acquiring, it really means issuing bank and acquiring bank are in the same location. And the reason that's important is the data that gets presented for the issuing bank to make decisions has a lot of influence over whether the issuing bank actually accepts the transaction. The merchant being in the same country as the issuing bank has a lot to do with the issuing bank accepting the transaction. And so that type of capability has a very profound influence on your acceptance rates. And it's also one of the most complex things to do, because what company out there has the resource to go set up acquiring relationships everywhere? It's just not something that's going to be economical for most companies. It's the largest brands in the world that might have the ability to do that. And so with a merchant of record solution like Digital Rivers, you really have the ability to passport into that country and leverage the payment relationships that have already been established by the merchant of record provider. And I think that gives companies a unique advantage because, again, you can take advantage of these investments that have been made to support some of the largest companies in the world in global e-commerce at an enormous scale without trying to make those investments just for you.
Thanks. Let me just dive even a little deeper just for those folks following along. So if you're basically leveraging a virtual, let's call it maybe a virtual bank, localized bank, right? So I say, okay, I don't have a bank in France. Digital River has their network there. I'm going to leverage the rails of Digital River to act as if I have a local bank in France, so that my virtual local bank, vis-a-vis Digital River, is communicating with the consumer's local bank. So now that's how I'm localizing. Correct?
You got it. Yep. You're going to passport in and leverage the banking infrastructure that Digital River has set up in country so that your authorization rates are much better.
Okay, and when Dan says authorization rates, what he's often referring to is that you're going to get less inaccurate declines. So, for example, if I'm a US, let's say, bank, and I'm communicating with the overseas bank, and I see a consumer who's purchased from a credit card that has 10 different email addresses, I might historically decline that if my US bank is not as familiar, perhaps, with international transactions. But in many countries around the world, a family might share a credit card and have multiple email addresses, whereas in some of our more enthusiastic credit shoppers, like in the US, we may have multiple credit cards to one email address because I have multiple credit cards. Is that on the right track?
Yeah, well said, Josh. We could really use your talk track here at Digital River. I think you said it very well. And it's an area that I think a lot of merchants would benefit from knowing more about so that they can do something about it in their business.
So that's great. I mean, I also just understanding for the idea of this, what is it called when, and maybe it's the same thing, when a merchant is selling a product, the moment that overseas consumer buys it, really Digital River turns around and buys it from the merchant and takes on, is that the taking on of the merchant of record? Is that what that means?
You got it. You can really think of Digital River as a sort of an intermediary that's going to help you pass title of your products from your ownership to the customer who's ultimately purchasing it. And it's that process that allows you to use Digital River in this role of performing merchant of record responsibilities on your behalf. And it's a very seamless process. It all happens behind the scenes, but it unlocks the ability for you to utilize this business model and tap into everything Digital River has already set up around the world.
And that also just, for a couple more things, that has a couple of values. So obviously we talked about the reason why it reduces inaccurate decline rates, but you're also, because you're transacting so much through Digital River, you have a stronger buying power to reduce the FX rates that an individual company may not be able to get, right? And you pass that along to your customers. Also accurate?
You got it. You got it. Yeah, we've set up quite a bit of banking around the world, and that really allows us to optimize for cost. And with billions of dollars that run through our solution, I think that gives mid-sized merchants and even large merchants a really unique advantage.
Okay. And then one of the reasons, lastly, that I really love this slide is a lot of companies will say to us, well, I already have Adyen. I have global payments. Tell us the difference of that, because you obviously are leveraging at a very split second the best solution at the time per, I guess, product category, geography, etc. Could you talk about the differences there?
Yeah, you got it. This kind of gets at the point I made towards the end about having a multi-processor or multi-acquiring strategy. A lot of these payment providers are absolutely wonderful at what they do. They have great solutions, excellent coverage, but I think it's impossible for any one of them to have a world-class solution everywhere. And so part of what a company like Digital River gets you is it gets you access to multiple acquiring and processing partners. And behind the scenes, Digital River has a lot of intelligence that tells us where to send payments so that we get the highest possible acceptance rates. And I think that's another example of an investment that would be difficult for most brands to make, but they can take advantage of in this merchant of record model.
That's really cool. All right, so let's go to the hero screen. The next slide. I do have some questions for you. If we're starting to set this up, how much does this type of thing cost? How much in not only in actual cost in cash, right? But how much does it cost in terms of investment and integration into our system? How big of a company you have to really be to take advantage of this, et cetera?
Yeah, great question, Josh. So we work with companies of basically all sizes. We have thousands of SMBs that do business with Digital River, all the way up to some of the largest enterprise companies in the world. So it's a solution that's really built for anyone. In terms of level of investment, of course, with any implementation of a payment solution or really any back office solution, there's some level of investment that you have to make. But we've really tried to make that as simple as possible. We have a couple of different implementation models, one of which is that we built pre-built integrations with most of the leading commerce platforms in the market. So if you use a third-party commerce platform that Digital River has an app for, then implementation is very straightforward because most of the work has already been done and it can be leveraged almost out of the box in combination with that commerce platform. We've also built some low and no code solutions for companies who maybe have an internally developed solution and want to leverage Digital River's API. And so level of investment up front is typically minimal. Of course, it depends on your requirements as a merchant. Ongoing, the way our cost structure works is that we operate on a percentage of sales model. And from our perspective, there's a couple of different ways to think about the ROI of using a solution like Digital River. One is that by combining all these capabilities into one solution, there's a cost benefit for you as a merchant. You don't have separate costs for tax solutions, for payment gateways, for fraud software. Those are all bundled inside of Digital River, and that gets you a cost efficiency, not only to buy these capabilities, but also to manage these capabilities. And then on the other hand, there's a revenue growth benefit to using Digital River. There's speed to market because you have all these capabilities out of the box and you don't have to invest in your back office before you go live. And there's also just better performance on the payment side. Some of the concepts that we talked about just a few minutes ago really have a positive revenue side ROI that I think makes it an attractive option for a lot of merchants.
That's awesome. Thank you, Dan. And just a real quick snapshot. How big is Digital River? How much are you guys transacting? And there might even be another slide about that.
Yeah. So we've got a bit of an overview here of who Digital River is and just some history about us. We've been in the digital e-commerce space for a number of years. And this is really what we do. We help brands execute this global expansion strategy. Our company is headquartered in Minneapolis, but we've got offices all around the world. We transact billions of dollars every year, and our customers are growing at a pace that I think is faster than most market segments in this space. And so we really have a tremendous amount of experience that I think many merchants who are thinking about going down this path could really benefit from.
All right, so there you have it. Dan Brewer, Digital River, talking all things cross-border as it pertains to optimization of logistics and payments and all the things that you need to do when you're really serious about global. So thanks so much for joining us, Dan.
Josh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, catch another video, follow us, subscribe, Grow Big initiative on how you can sell more online internationally and domestically. We'll catch you soon.